Maybe we could begin with how you first came to become a meditation teacher.
Well, I have been practicing already for probably about 20 years. So I came to meditation through academic study of Buddhism in university in my undergraduate years and was a practitioner for many years, but really kind of off and on, a young person sort of partying, but also dabbling and kind of running to my practice in times of heartbreak or difficulty. But when I was diagnosed with breast cancer when I was 34, about 15 years ago, I really just kind of deepened my practice and started doing more retreats and more study and started working full time at a meditation center. So I became the executive director of New York Insight Meditation Center, just a large insight center here in the city. And then from there, started leading groups and sits. And our guiding teacher there, Gina Sharp, invited me to enter the Community Dharma Leader program out at Spirit Rock Meditation Center, which is in North America, kind of the leading kind of training program for people to start to become Dharma teachers, Dharma leaders.
Right. And so you recently wrote this wonderful book, You Belong, which I highly recommend. It's full of lots of great wisdom from both the kind of Buddhist tradition, but also from your own lived experience. And I really like that the title obviously refers to this kind of core teaching of that well, maybe I should let you maybe say in your own words, this kind of deep belonging that exists that, can both be described at a kind of on a spiritual level, but also scientifically. We see this picture of the world that we're all really part of the same thing.
Yeah, the book, I keep kind of stating this sentence a few times that we are not separate and we are not the same. And so the book really grapples with this seeming paradox, I think conceptual paradox, that we have these different bodies, these different realities, these different histories. There's all sorts of cultural differences between us. So we can experience this relative reality that, you're in Portugal right now and I'm in New York, and we're not the same person. But as you said, spiritual truths and scientific truths point to the fact that there's actually no separation, that we originated from the same tiny, teeny, teensy point that's basically nothing, and that we are still kind of this ever-expanding, vibrating energy patterns. And so to really use that paradox as a way to start to understand why we feel feelings of separation and how we can come back to touching into this truth of the fact that we are interconnected fundamentally, and our personal well-being and our collective well-being really depends on us understanding that.
Right. And there's something that you refer to in the book that I also kind of go on and on about, my audience will know, which is the doctrine of two truths that, kind of captures what you were just saying, that in absolute terms, we're all the same thing, but there is still this relative level, So I think most people are living in the relative level before they hear any of this stuff. They discover that there's this absolute level. And then sometimes people can, I guess, maybe fall into the trap of thinking the program is to try and fully move beyond yourself, fully negate all of the relative stuff and just live in the absolute. But I'm always arguing that everything we're talking about here is the complexity of, the absolute is very simple. The fact that we all belong and we're all part of the same thing is very simple, but there's a lot of complexity, right? In how you reckon with that, given that you are this relatively separate thing.
Yeah, it's so important what you're pointing out, because the challenge really is finding our particular balance. And by balance, I don't mean that like everything feels like completely balanced between these truths, but to understand where we're limited in our understanding or our acceptance of both truths. Like what I love about this doctrine of two truths is that there are two truths. They're both true. So that's why they're a paradox, because they seemingly contradict each other. And we can tend to as you were describing, bypass, when we want to kind of lose ourselves in the truth of the absolute and the interconnection. It can be a way to not have to deal with the complexity and messiness of the relative differences and realities. We can also like drown in that complexity and kind of lose our connection to that truth of interconnection. And so each of us has to sort of navigate what that balance is for us and start to see the ways in which, we'll kind of tip over into one or the other to avoid pain, to, kind of try and treat our trauma, to lose ourselves, to, not see what we don't want to see.
Yeah, I think that's really important as well. The idea you're saying of, we're not separate, but we're not the same. And the kind of the bypassing that can occur when you think, I've seen it a lot, and it seems to have been very maybe common in the kind of first wave of meditation coming into the West in maybe the 60s and 70s, where at first glance, I would have thought, this group of people who are all interested in these, these kinds of interests they'd get it when it comes to maybe like social issues and all the kind of complexities there. But then you see this very common kind of bypassing where it's like, well, we're all the same. We're all the ultimate. So forget about all that identity stuff. Forget about all the complexities there. I don't want to hear it. And it becomes this very kind of unfortunate way to kind of silence really important discussions, where I think, at least that's what I've perceived, that it can be used as, to kind of to bypass all the difficulties and complexities that do exist on the relative level.
Yeah, most of us are not very good at intimacy. And practice is really asking us to get intimate with our experience. But our experience isn't only about our internal reality, it's about how we move through the world. And so if we are kind of bypassing or blocking or denying other people's realities, we're not able to really be intimate with what they're expressing. And so often the bypass can happen internally, where we don't want to deal with our anger. That was kind of the original meaning of the coining of that term. Spiritual bypass by John Welwood is what he called premature transcendence. This tendency for meditators or people who are coming into contact with these very powerful transcendent teachings to not want to deal with the messiness of their reality, their trauma, their rage, their sadness, their depression, and use the teachings to kind of not feel that. And there's been so much work. And, since the 60s, so many of these people encountered, mostly white, Americans and Europeans who encountered these teachings in usually Asia, then went on to study psychology. Like so many of these teachers are actually psychologists. And that often came after, their contact with these teachings, because there was so much psychological material to kind of contend with and deal with and sort through. And there was kind of a rectifying of that element of bypass. But what you're describing, and I think what we're talking about, is this bypass that happens in relationship, in community, in cross-cultural spaces. That, okay, so maybe we're not bypassing our own emotions and our own experiences, but we start to kind of bypass the experience of others, the experience in relationship, in community. It can be easier to do that work and that reckoning and that really coming into contact with these intimate parts of ourselves on the cushion alone. To do that actually with others, and then with others who have really different experiences and perceptions of the world, it gets complicated, it gets messy.
Yeah, I really feel like the thing you're describing is kind of the ultimate task of existence, at least as I see it. It seems to me the final kind of the hardest thing to really master. And I think probably because there is no mastery, as you say, intimacy is a really important word where, on the individual level, as you say, you've got kind of separation, and kind of the Buddhist psychology teaches us that creates suffering. And so when you have these, unitive states and you move beyond separation, you feel like you belong, it can be tempting to have that individual spiritual bypassing and just go, great, I'll just forget about all my issues. I don't need to deal with my trauma. I can just be enlightened and try and inhabit this state. And then, as you say, so that's one thing, but then you go into a web of community where we're all kind of, if someone, intimacy is the right word, is the challenge, because we would all love to be in that kind of feeling of complete belonging, complete openness. But usually it's not that simple. If you think you belong in the situation where a lion wants to eat you, you're going to die because you're going to be, if you fully surrender and say, this is wonderful, it's just the play of existence, so it makes sense that there's some dance rate between wanting to just surrender and melt into everything, but then wanting to kind of navigate this through being a separate thing. And yeah, I think intimacy and vulnerability and community is just a lifelong project of figuring that out.
Yeah. And, most of us experience that initially and perpetually in our own families. And we can see, I don't know a family that doesn't have challenges at some kind of point in its configuration. And so that when you extend that out into peers and friends and colleagues, not to mention sort of our geographic and social communities and larger communities, it becomes more and more complex. And so it's important to see how we can bring practice to that as well.